I want to begin by thanking ASHA and NIDCD and the Symposium Organizing Committee, I guess Margaret, for inviting Will and I to present our work on the Aphasia Communication Outcome Measure here today. And I too want to take a moment to acknowledge Will Hula's substantive contributions to this work from the very beginning. And unlike Catherine, who is up here because she has more gray hair than Carolyn did, I'm up here because I have more hair than Will does. Our work is supported by the Department of Veterans Affairs Rehabilitation Research and Development Service, and aside from that disclosure, I have no other disclosures to make. We are going to drill down, I think, even a little bit further in our presentation today. I'm going to begin just by discussing briefly by placing PROs in the context of clinical outcome measurement for aphasia in general. And then I'll spend a little bit of time discussing limitations of existing measures for aphasia with a focus on the issue of construct dimensionality. After that, we'll present the results of the initial field trial of the ACOM, as well as the results of the computer adaptive test simulation of the item bank, and then wrap it up with a discussion of the future direction of our work within the context of the challenges facing our profession to demonstrate the value of our services. So, the concept of PROs grew out of the literature on health-related quality of life. And for well over a decade now, patient-reported outcomes have been an active topic of discussion among government regulatory agencies, the pharmaceutical industry, and medical outcomes researchers. In 2003, a working group of representatives from industry, academia, and government defined patient-reported outcomes as the patient's assessment of a health condition and its treatment. It defined health-related quality of life more narrowly as the patient's evaluation of the impact of a health condition and its treatment on daily life. And patient-reported outcomes are complementary to other kinds of outcomes which may be classified according to the source of the information that they represent. So by 2006, the FDA had issued guidance to pharmaceutical and medical product developers regarding the use of PROs to support labeling claims, and CMS had invested in the Health Outcomes Survey, which is a patient-reported measure that managed care organizations participating in Medicare Part C are required to use. And further evidence of the increasing importance being placed on patient-reported outcomes is exemplified by the development of the Continuity Assessment Record Evaluation, or CARE instruments, that are part of a CMS-sponsored project to develop alternative outpatient therapy payment models based upon the needs of beneficiaries and the effectiveness of services rendered, as measured to a large extent by patient-reported outcomes. And among the factors driving the move toward the use of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials and in other contexts are increasing patient empowerment, driven in part by increased access to information via the internet, an increasing awareness and appreciation of the value of the patient's perspective in both diagnosis and in treatment, an acknowledgement that physiological and clinical measures frequently fail to capture important aspects of health outcomes, and perhaps most importantly, as we heard, I think, on several occasions earlier today, policy-driven changes in healthcare payment models. So at the time we began our work on the ACOM, back in, I think, 2003, patient-reported measures of communicative functioning were limited to brief subscales of lengthy, multi-component health status assessments, such as Duncan's Stroke Impact Scale, Williams' Stroke Survivor or Stroke-Specific Quality of Life Scale, and the BOSS, the Burden of Stroke Scale. And these instruments were developed to measure a broad range of functional outcomes in stroke survivors, and so their individual subscales necessarily contained a limited number of items, making them prone to ceiling and floor effects and limiting their precision for assessing any given functional domain, such as communication. Now, also available at the time was the activity measure for post-acute care applied cognition scale, which contains content related to communication as well as aspects of cognition. And the AMPAC Applied Cognition Scale represented a real step forward at the time in that it was developed using modern scaling methods based in item response theory. It contained a relatively large number of items targeting a single construct, and it was available in computer adaptive test format, potentially lessening the response burden of the instrument. However, because the AMPAC Applied Cognition Scale conflates the assessment of communicative functioning with other aspects of cognition, we had concerns about its use in stroke survivors with aphasia. So here's the 10-item short form of the AMPAC Applied Cognition Scale. And you can see that it asks about activities requiring a range of abilities, including auditory verbal communication, reading and writing, money management, and other executive and problem-solving abilities. And a central question is whether it's valid to model these items as responding to a single, undifferentiated construct, or whether they're determined by distinct, though perhaps correlated factors. And this really is an important question because the IRT models, as we have heard many times today, the IRT models that underlie much of the recent progress in patient-reported outcome measurement make strong assumptions about the dimensionality of the items in a given scale. Now, when we examined the literature describing the development of the AMPAC, we believe that it had limitations that could have practical consequences for measuring outcomes in persons with aphasia. Specifically, the initial factor analytic work reported by Haley and colleagues resulted in an item pool that was comprised almost entirely of communication items alone. But in subsequent work, Koster and colleagues included memory, problem solving, and other cognition items without reevaluating the factor structure. Another limitation pertained to how differential item functioning, or DIF, was assessed, another concept that we've heard about earlier today. And in differential item functioning analysis asks whether items have invariant locations on the trait level scale in different subgroups with the same total score. And when a putatively unidimensional test reflects an additional dimension that is substantively related to membership in a given subgroup, and DIF is found for that subgroup, that's an indicator of multidimensionality. And so an example of subgroups like this would be left hemisphere stroke survivors and who one might expect to have difficulty or be differentially impaired with respect to cognition versus left hemisphere stroke survivors who one might expect to be differentially impaired with respect to communication. So when we examined the differential item functioning analyses reported for the AMPAC applied cognition items, we found that they were based upon heterogeneous samples of 3 broadly classified groups, including patients with neurological conditions, musculoskeletal conditions, and complex medical conditions. And when you consider that the neurological group alone included patients with stroke, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, TBI, spinal cord injury, and neuropathy, many of these groups not having communication disorders at all, we hypothesized that had the differential item functioning contrasts been evaluated in more homogeneous subgroups, for example, left hemisphere versus right hemisphere stroke survivors, that different results might have been obtained. And so this led us, these considerations led us to conduct a study asking specifically whether patient-reported cognitive and communicative functioning can be validly measured as a single construct using a single unidimensional scale, or if they are 2 distinct constructs requiring separate scales or an explicitly multi-dimensional measurement model. And to address this question, we conducted a secondary analysis of data originally collected during the development of the burden of stroke scale. And in the next several slides, I'll present selected results from a 2010 report that's published in the archives of PM&R that address this question. So here we show the burden of stroke scale cognition and communication domain scales, which you will note have substantial overlap in item content with the AMPAC applied cognition scale that I showed to you just a few slides ago. We analyzed the responses to these items in 176 unilateral left hemisphere stroke survivors and 140 unilateral right hemisphere stroke survivors. And as part of this study, we fit the data to a Rasch partial credit model, and 11 of the 12 items showed adequate fit according to the same criteria used to evaluate the AMPAC applied cognition scale. And one item, the item write a letter, showed significant misfit, and so that item was excluded from further analyses. So going forward now, I'm going to focus on the results of our differential item functioning analysis, as well as some additional tests that we conducted to assess the practical impact of the differential item functioning and the multidimensionality that we found. And for the purposes, now this has been presented a couple times today, so this is review. But for the purposes of presenting the differential item functioning results, it's important to understand that Rasch and IRT measurement models place both items and persons on a single latent trait scale, where persons can have more or less of the trait in question, and items require more or less of that trait to achieve a certain score. So here we show a graph, or I should say we show Rasch partial credit model category response curves for a single item. How difficult is it for you to find the words you want to say? And trait level is represented along the horizontal axis, and the probability of responding in a given category is displayed on the vertical axis. And you can see that as patients move up the trait level scale, they'll be less likely to respond to this activity as being very difficult, and correspondingly more likely to respond that it's moderately, a little, or not at all difficult. And again, it's important to note that each response category of the item is also represented with a location on the trait level scale, so that these locations will be higher on the scale for items that ask about difficult activities and lower on the scale for items that describe easier activities. Okay? So in the context of this measurement model, differential item functioning analysis asks whether items have the same locations on the latent trait scale in different subgroups of patients after differences in the overall trait level between the subgroups has been accounted for. So let's look at the results of our initial differential item functioning analysis on the combined 11-item cognition and communication scale. So the item content you see is here on the x-axis, and the diff contrast is here on the y-axis. The diff contrast, again, the difference in item location between the two subgroups, okay, shown here on the vertical axis. So values on the top indicate item content that was more difficult for the right hemisphere group, and values on the bottom indicate content that was more difficult for the left hemisphere group. And you can see that almost half the items represented with these asterisks showed significant differential item functioning in the expected direction, with the cognition items obtaining location estimates indicating that they were relatively more difficult for the right hemisphere stroke survivors, and the communication items obtaining location estimates indicating that they were more difficult for the left hemisphere stroke survivors. In contrast, when we fit the cognition and communication scales to separate Rasch models, the diff goes away for all but this one item. And again, this is because diff analysis asks whether a given item location is the same for individuals in two different groups who have the same total score. And when that total score is restricted to cognition items on the one hand, or communication items on the other hand, the items function invariantly across the groups. And it is this measurement invariance that's required for valid application of these sorts of measurement models. So as I indicated earlier, we also conducted two further sets of analyses to assess the practical impact of the multidimensionality revealed in the preceding diff analyses. And first, we estimated a cognition score and a communication score separately for each participant and cross-plotted him. So these curved lines represent approximate 95% confidence intervals about the assumption that scores on the two scales were equal. And despite the relatively high correlation between the two scales, a substantial number of individuals, 16%, keep losing my cursor here, 16% obtained significantly different scores on the two scales. Specifically, we had 30 patients down here in the lower right who had worse communication scores than cognition scores, and 28 of those 30 patients were left hemisphere stroke survivors. And we had 22 patients in the upper left here who had worse cognition scores than communication scores, and 15 of those were right hemisphere stroke survivors. Finally, we asked whether the separate scales were more sensitive than the combined scale to between group differences in the presence versus the absence of cognitive impairment on the one hand and communication impairment on the other. We had 81 patients in the sample who were diagnosed as having aphasia, apraxia of speech, or dysarthria, and an additional 69 who were free of any communication disorders. And in this slide, we can see that the communication scale was significantly more sensitive than the cognition scale to this between group difference, and the communication scale approached significance over the combined scale, but this is not a statistically reliable difference here between the communication scale and the combined scale. Likewise, a subsample of 73 patients were diagnosed as having cognitive impairment other than aphasia, and 77 were diagnosed as being free of cognitive impairments. And here, the cognition scale, the BOSS cognition scale, was significantly more sensitive to the communication scale and significantly more sensitive than the combined scale. So these findings led us to conclude that to capture patient-reported communicative functioning in stroke survivors with aphasia, that there was a need for an assessment focused on communication to the exclusion of other cognitive functions. And so it was within this context that we set out to develop an IRT-calibrated item bank that could be used to support computerized adaptive or static paper and pencil assessment of patient-reported communicative functioning. And we began by developing a large pool of assessment items describing everyday listening, speaking, reading, and writing activities. The item development process is described in a 2008 aphasiology manuscript, but let me just briefly mention that prior to Catherine's talk a few moments ago, I had in here that we followed best practice in developing our items. But after listening to Catherine's talk, I think she demonstrated best practice, although we did many of the things in our item development process, including to ensure the content relevance and representativeness of the items, including patients with aphasia, their caregivers, clinical providers, and an expert panel of aphasiologists throughout the whole item development process. I'm not going to spend any more time on that particular aspect of our development. Those procedures are in the literature. Here, I'm just going to provide a few examples of item content, and note that we designed our items to be answered by the person with aphasia or a surrogate who knows them well, and that all items are responsive to this same 4-point scale. So trained research staff collected responses to candidate items from 329 community dwelling persons with aphasia and their surrogates using an interviewer-assisted administration format. So each item was displayed to participants on a computer screen, as you see here. Participants were permitted to give their responses verbally, by pointing to the screen, or both. And in instances where there was any uncertainty about the intended response, we had a standardized procedure by which the examiner confirmed the response by repeating the item content again and the participant's response back to the participant while pointing at the response category on the screen, just to verify the response. So before I discuss the patient-reported data, I just want to take a moment to discuss the extent to which patient and surrogate ratings agreed with one another. This came up just a few moments ago. And it remains an issue in patient-reported outcome measurement in stroke survivors and in other clinical populations for whom the reliability of self-reports is questioned. So the scatter plot here reveals moderate agreement. We have an R-square of 0.51 between the self-reports of persons with aphasia and surrogate reports. But there was a significant number of discrepancies. That is, 30% of the individuals, there were significant discrepancies between the reports of the person with aphasia and the surrogate. We conducted additional analyses, independent analyses of these, to see if the patient responses and the surrogate responses could be directly compared and measured using a common scale. And this is analogous to the diff issue that we raised earlier with respect to measuring cognitive and communication items on the same scale. And what we found was that patient and surrogates could, in fact, be measured along the same scale, but that the costs in terms of validity and reliability were not acceptable. That is, in order for us to construct scales that functioned invariantly for both the patient and the surrogates, we had to exclude so many items that it negatively affected the resulting scale properties. So we concluded that while surrogate reports certainly represent a valid perspective on communication outcomes as measured by the ACOM, we believe that they should not be substituted for or used interchangeably with self-reports in persons with aphasia. And for those of you that are interested in more of the details of this work, it's published in a recent 2012 Quality of Life Research report. Okay, so for the remainder of our presentation, I'm going to focus on the patient-reported data. I'm going to present a series of factor analysis results, again, focusing on the dimensionality issue, and describe how we've established a working version of the ACOM item bank, and then I'll follow up with a presentation of the results of our simulation study before discussing the future directions of our work. So as noted earlier, IRT models that underlie computer-adapted testing and other recent improvements in patient-reported outcome measurement make strong assumptions about the dimensionality of this construct being measured. And the simplest and the most commonly used IRT models assume that all items respond to a single unidimensional construct. So in this diagram, the squares represent the observed item variables, and the circle represents the underlying factor that they reflect. In this case, patient-reported communicative and functioning. In our earlier presentation, communication participation, right? It's the underlying construct. The path arrows are similar to regression coefficients, and they represent the strength of the association between the underlying factor and the item responses. So it's the case, except that we saw a few cases here this afternoon that would argue against this, but it's the case that frequently patient-reported item sets constructed to assess usefully broad domains of functioning with enough items to offer the possibility of reliable measurement fail to show adequate fit to a unidimensional model. And that was indeed the case with our data as well when we attempted to fit a unidimensional confirmatory factor model. The initial ACOM item pool obtained a root mean square value of 0.1, where above 0.1, I should say, where less than 0.06 is a generally accepted criterion for adequate fit. So we followed up with an exploratory analysis, and we used parallel analysis with simulated random data sets to determine how many factors to extract from the data. And as you see in the scree plot here, the parallel analyses indicated that we needed to extract 5 factors from the data. So in fitting a 5-factor model now to the data, we selected a bifactor model, which is an approach that is increasingly being used in developing these sorts of patient-reported outcome measures. And an exploratory bifactor model proposes that each item responds to a general factor and one or more specific, or what are referred to as local factors, that account for variance shared among subgroups of items. And importantly, the factors are all constrained to be uncorrelated with one another, so essentially forcing the common variance that's shared by all of the items into the general factor. So in practice, these local factors are often defined by similarities in item content. For example, items having to do with writing as opposed to conversing as opposed to naming. And one of the advantages of the bifactor model is that it can provide the desired single overall score, which is useful for outcome evaluation, while controlling for additional sources of variance. And further, to the extent that there is enough specific variance remaining to support reliable measurement of the local factors, then one may be able to estimate subscale scores as well. So in this slide, we show the item loadings on the general factor, represented here in the path diagram. And you can see in the histogram that they were generally high, with the large majority of items loading at 0.5 or higher. Okay? And the loadings on the local factors, again, represented here in the path diagram, were on average smaller and centered close to 0. However, there were a number of significant positive loadings that you see here on the local factors, and these corresponded with meaningful distinctions in item content that you see here and that you see here. So, based on item content associated with the local factors, they appear to correspond with the following potential subdomains of communicative functioning: writing and number use, auditory comprehension, naming, conversation, and recitation of sequences. And we use the output of the exploratory factor analysis to reduce the item set down to 56 items by eliminating items that either loaded less than 0.4 on the general factor, or that had positive salient loadings on multiple specific factors, or that had large correlated residuals after fitting a confirmatory bifactor model. Okay? So finally, we fit a confirmatory bifactor model to the reduced item set of 56 items. And as you can see here, the data showed adequate fit to this model with comparative fit and Tucker-Lewis indices both above 0.95 and a root mean square error of approximation less than 0.05. And the confirmatory bifactor model explained 60% of the total variance, with the general factor accounting for nearly 3/4 of the explained variance, and the specific factors accounting for less than 10% each. And what we show here are the number of items associated with each factor and the scale reliabilities in our current sample, and the low reliability quotients associated with these specific factors suggest that it would not be productive to try to measure them in the presence of the large general factor. So we then proceeded to fit a bifactor graded response IRT model to the data and estimated person distribution scores for our sample along that general dimension. And trait level estimates were scaled to have a mean of 0, a standard deviation of approximately 1, and as you can see in this slide, they were fairly well normally distributed. So with these results in hand, we proceeded to examine the feasibility and the potential value of a shortened, I should say, computerized adaptive test version of the ACOM. And again, in the way of review, since we've been through this a couple times today, I think most of you by now are familiar with the logic and the procedures behind a CAT. So just very briefly and quickly, you begin with a provisional estimate of the patient's trait level. In the absence of any other information, you can simply assume that the individual is at the mean of the calibration sample. You select an item that provides the most information about a patient at that particular trait level, and this is usually going to be an item whose item location on the test matches the trait level estimate of the patient. Next, you collect a response from the patient, and then you revise your trait level estimate. Then you re-estimate, you collect the response. Based upon that response, you revise the trait level estimate, and then you examine whether or not your stopping rule is satisfied. And stopping rules can be determined on the basis of a set number of items or on a level of precision for the score estimate, or on a combination of those. And so then you proceed, and in the data that I'm going to show you, I should say, we set our decision rule at 15 items. Okay, our stopping rule, I should say, at administration of 15 items. So you repeat steps 2 through 5 until your stopping rule is satisfied, and then you stop the test and you calculate the final trait level estimate and its confidence interval. So we used the data from the full 56-item bank to conduct real data simulations of a 15-item static short form and a 15-item computerized adaptive test, and compared the resulting score and precision estimates. So this slide presents a comparison between scores obtained from the 15-item static short form and the full 56-item bank, and the R-square value was reasonably high at 0.87. And here's the comparison between the 15-item CAT and the full item bank, and you can see here the R-square was even higher at 0.91. But the advantage of the CAT over the static short form can most clearly be seen on this graph, which shows test precision as a function of trait level estimates. So the standard error of the trait level estimates is represented along the vertical axis. And what you can see is, although the static short form, represented here in red, approaches the precision of the CAT in the middle of the score distribution, the CAT provides much more precise estimates at the edges, or at the range at either end of the distribution. And for reference, in the current sample, 0.3, a standard error of 0.3 corresponds to a coefficient, a reliability coefficient of about 0.91. So while we have much work to do, including establishing the convergent and divergent validity of the ACOM and evaluating its sensitivity to change, determining minimal clinically important differences, we believe that the results regarding the basic structure of the ACOM are promising. We should note that we have a prospective field trial ongoing now, comparing the ACOM CAT to a static short form version and the full item bank that's currently underway in an independent sample of stroke survivors with aphasia, in an attempt to replicate the simulated data that we just presented. In developing the ACOM, we are attempting to be responsive to the growing need for patient-centered outcomes that may be easily communicated to the public, to policymakers, and to payers. And as our profession responds to these issues, we believe that it will be essential to balance the need for simplicity and efficiency with the need to be as rigorous as possible in our approach to measurement. So an important issue that we have not yet begun to address, and again, which has been discussed several times here today, is the extent to which scales like the ACOM, or is the extent to which the ACOM could be applied to other clinical populations with communication disorders. We believe that it's unlikely that a scale developed to provide optimal reliability and validity for persons with aphasia will provide satisfactory outcome measurement for other populations. But the beautiful thing is that we have a colleague that will have the opportunity to do that here soon. But it may be possible to identify a core set of items that approximate key measurement model assumptions, including the assumption of item invariance across communicatively impaired populations. And such a scale may not be particularly useful for outcome measurement in individual cases, but it very well could be useful in the context of institutional, national, regional, or national databases. So I want to acknowledge our collaborators on this project, Shannon Osterman, Hula, Clem Stone, Julie Rwambaugh, Catherine Ross, Jim Schumacher, and Rohrig, and leave you with this final thought from Bond and Fox, that the quality of a discipline's measures determine the value of its treatment and policy decisions. Thank you.
For those of you who have entered recently, I'm Margaret Rogers. I'm ASHA's Chief Staff Officer for Science and Research, and I want to thank you, Pat, for really a very thoughtful and intriguing talk. I don't know that I will say this just right, but bear with me. You had talked about the fact that the local factors really needed to be accounted for independently, though you didn't use that word. And I'm wondering, in the CAT with 15 items, how you dealt with the 5 categories, the local factors of conversation, writing and number use, auditory comprehension, naming and recitation of sequences. Did you combine them in that?
Well, no, our CAT was based upon the 56 items from the general factor. Am I right about that, Will?
So it mixed all...
well, no, it didn't miss it, but they're...
Mixed.
It didn't miss it. Those items are in there.
Mixed with an X. Mixed.
Oh,
mixed.
Mixed,
all
yes.
5 factors mixed into the CAT.
Will, do you want to comment on that?
So, yes, in the simulation we presented, all items were drawn from across those 5 factors that comprise the 56 items. That's correct. I mean, it's an important issue, actually, content balancing. So when we, as we're moving ahead, we're including in the CAT algorithm a mechanism for ensuring that the overall makeup of the CAT reflects the makeup of the original item pool. If you get what I'm saying. So that items are selected from the pool in roughly the same proportion in which they're represented in the item bank. Because otherwise you can get some distortion there.
And so I'm left a little confused because I'm also wondering why then it was necessary that the 5 local factors not correlate with each other. Do you know that?
That is also a Will question. I mean, that's the way the bifactor model works, but Will, maybe you can explain further. I mean, that's an assumption of the model.
Right. It's an assumption of the model that's actually necessary to make the model estimable.
So I think, Margaret, it's not that all of those items aren't represented in the item pool. There are reading and writing and auditory comprehension items that are represented in the item pool, but all of the common variance is forced into this general factor. And it allows you then to compute this single score, as opposed, it gives you a single score that you could use for outcome measurement. And as you saw in the data, there wasn't sufficient scale reliability to validly try to capture these local factors.
Yeah, so maybe it's important to clarify that in using the Bifactor model, those local sources of variance are effectively conditioned out. We're interested in that single general factor that's useful for outcome measurement, and we're specifically, developing a score that captures that general factor, the variance in that general factor, and we're specifically leaving out these local factors that are accounting for much less of the variance.
So something different, like true multidimensionality. I was just asking to clarify that this use of the Bifactor model is different than having, say, 5 separate factors.
Yeah, we're using the Bifactor model to get to a single measure that we're going to treat like a unidimensional measure, but like a unidimensional score, because it comes from that one general factor. In other applications I've seen in the field of psychiatry, sometimes they end up with a general factor as well as local factors that are still pulling enough variance that make them useful to measure on their own, which didn't turn out to be the case in our data.
So from a kind of a clinical hat now, I'm wondering, while I certainly would expect that you could estimate the trait level based on conversation, auditory comprehension, and naming, because I would gather, from my clinical experience, that they'll be highly correlated. But writing could be very different in clinical experience, although I don't know what the measure of that is, or number use, and just wondering to the extent that you truly can treat all the 15 items. I would take 15 items to kind of, I would expect 15 items to get at any one of these traits in terms of the difficulty level. But this is intriguing, and when you do it in real patients, perhaps it'll be that you need more items?
Well, these are real data, Margaret. These are real data taken from the responses. We simulated them, that they're real data simulations, right? They're real data simulations.
From real people?
Yes.
Yes, using real data from real people. Yeah. It's a bit of a...
Real data simulations. That's like genuine simulated diamonds, remember?
in the interest of full disclosure, we're estimating the model and looking at and comparing the cat to the full item bank, all in the same set of data. So, it's a little bit cheating, right? Because it's all the same data, and that's and to that extent, the cat simulations represent maybe like a best case scenario for what we might find when we actually do this in a new sample.
But again, to clarify, the data are from the responses of the sample of stroke survivors.
I'll ask a quick question. I was just wondering about the screen where you had, I think, the response screen that the participants saw that had kind of a visual bar along the side that had the verbal response categories and then a percentage value, and I wasn't sure if that percentage value came from something or you were using it as kind of a guide to what each category meant. And I guess my question came, if you set those percentage levels, if somebody had kind of an incongruency between how they conceptualized the word versus how they conceptualized the percent. So I was just curious about that screen.
Yeah, we use them to define the categories. In piloting some of the items, we saw individuals using completely, in a way that did not sort of match with the concept. And so we use them, to further define these response categories.
I would just follow up on that to say that in the new CMS administrative rule, they've turned the NOM scale into a percentage scale, and the percentages aren't associated with anything. you're functioning at 70%, and we don't know if that's, successful attempts at a task or the percent of time that you think you're doing. So the percent thing, I think, is coming up in a lot of places of people wondering, why are we putting percentages on things that are conceptual? And I think, it's something that certainly needs to be done in modeling.
Yeah, what we didn't present was our instructions and definition, and our definition for effectively. So, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but we put them in there. What was our definition, Will? That you do it without assistance, without delay, and I can't remember exactly what the operational definition was for effectively, and we were using these percentages as well as the category concepts there to help scale the categories.
Yeah. Okay, Neil, and then I see something else.
Okay. I just want to go back and clarify, not on the Bifactor model, but on the 50 items that were in the general factor.
The general factor, yeah.
And so am I right to think that if I saw those on the scale, that there'd be 56 items according to difficulty, but the various local factor items would be, not local factor, but there'd be various items like reading, writing,
Yes.
conversation. So
Yes.
the reading and writing items might be high on the scale of the ones you used. And so if you're doing a 15-item short form and you knew you had somebody who was impaired, significantly impaired, they might get the bottom items, like maybe comprehension and things like that. Is that a fair way to think about this?
Well,
from the general, thinking about this general factor that you have?
Yeah, I think I can answer. When you select items for either a short form, you're going to select your items. Will, you did this, that cover the range of item difficulty. And in the CAT, of course, the CAT algorithm is going to determine the item difficulty based upon the preceding response. So, and as you saw, from the simulated data, we were getting precise estimates in both the static short form as well as the 15-item CAT. But yeah, you're right. All of those different items, reading items, comprehension items, talking items, will all be represented in the CAT as well as in or depending upon the patient, right, and in the static short form.
So you had sort of said that something to the effect of this really might not be that useful at an individual level, but it is more kind of a population-based level. But did you want to revise that? Because I think it is useful at an individual level.
No, the point that I was making there was with respect to the ACOM being applicable to other populations of communicatively impaired individuals. And this is why I'm really happy that Carolyn got this grant, that she's going to be able to look at her items in an aphasic population, because up until now they've demonstrated no differential item functioning across groups of patients that primarily have speech production disorders. Is that fair to say, Catherine? And I think aphasia is a very different animal. And so I was making the point that I thought we believe it's going to be difficult to construct scales that function optimally for measuring communicative functions in people with aphasia. And have them also provide satisfactory measurement in other populations. But that, and this is another opportunity here to cross-calibrate some items from these different scales, which actually we've talked about and actually submitted a R01 to try to do, but that didn't turn out so well. It may be possible to have a core set of items that might function invariantly across those populations, but we're just not so sure how well such a scale might work at the individual level, but it might work just fine at institutional, regional, organizational levels was the point that we were making there. Yeah, well.
Just to maybe try and make that point a little more concrete, I mean, the issue is that to get a scale that will function variantly across all these disparate groups, you may end up having to throw out a lot of item content, and when you throw out item content, you can end up reducing the reliability of your measurement. And so, for making for measuring individual outcomes, you need more reliability. When you have a large data set, the noise can cancel itself out, and you don't need so much, and that's the point we're trying to get at there.
And then I have one last question, and that is the use of this for measuring outcomes in the sense of an admission at a pre-time and then again at a discharge or even periodically. And I'm wondering, with your stop rule, do you think that 15 items is sufficient for the purpose of measuring pre-post outcomes?
Well, we got precision estimates and score estimates that were pretty similar to the full 56-item bank.
Okay.
I mean, that's the empirical answer. But, the other thing I would say, too, is those stopping rules are, you can set stopping rules. You can set a stopping rule for 20 items, or you could set a stopping rule for a certain level of precision. So in our example, we set it at 15 items, and it's just an example. You can set your stopping rule higher for more items. But I think, the message is that we got as precise score estimates with 15 items as we did with the 56-item bank, almost. I mean, the full bank obviously functioned better than either the short form or the CAT, but they performed pretty well.
If I could follow up, kind of representing Karen Cook, who's not here, but I know in some of their tests of looking at item banks versus CAT administrations, when they set the stopping rules, not so much on the number of items, but on precision of measurement, that in some of their tests, they've been able to get nearly as precise as measurement to the full form, like you're getting very precise measurements with 3 or 4 items. Yeah. And so the response burden goes down tremendously. And I think as clinicians, it's a little bit tough to get our minds around saying, I'm going to ask 3 items that only, and only these 3 situations might come up, and I have to trust that that's really tested this person. But with all of this measurement science behind it that this group is talking about, we have to trust that, yes, when the items are calibrated well and, it's all working well, yes, those 3 or 4 or 5 items will give you as precise.
Yeah, I think the other point, I agree. The other point to be made is Margaret, that, perhaps you might, if your purpose for assessment is for another purpose, to develop a treatment plan, for example, you may want more than 3 items, but if it's to, determine group membership or determine outcome, and you're just looking for a single score estimate, I agree with Carolyn. You can frequently get precise score estimates with very few items. You might not want to do that if you're using that test for planning therapy. You might want more items.